My name is Allison. I am 28 years old and I live and work in Boston at a medical technology company. My life had been quiet, until it was torn apart by a cold sentence spoken during my own brother's wedding. Right in the glittering ballroom of a five-star hotel in Chicago, just after the MC finished inviting the bride and groom to the stage, Emily, my brother's fiancée, stepped up to the microphone, her eyes sparkling and her smile perfectly composed. Then, in front of hundreds of guests, she said words that froze the entire room. "Sorry, but I cannot let this poor family ruin the dignity of my wedding. Allison, I suggest you and your parents leave immediately." I had no time to react. Michael, my brother, once the pride of our family, merely smiled and turned to look at his fiancée with admiration. I could not tell which hurt more, being humiliated in front of everyone or seeing my own brother standing there, complicit in that humiliation. Have you ever been turned away by your own family in the middle of a crowd? So leave a comment. Please like, subscribe, and share this video if you believe self-respect should not be buried under the stage lights. Because just minutes later, everything at that wedding would collapse in a way no one could imagine. I can still remember the feeling of standing motionless in that lavish hall, as if my feet had been nailed to the cold tile floor. Emily's words were not only a slap to my face, they were a slap to the dignity of my whole family. But what left me speechless was not the public insult itself. It was my brother's complacent gaze as he stood beside her, silently watching me as if I were the stain they needed to remove. I am Allison. I live in Boston and work as a project manager for a medical technology firm. I am not famous nor glamorous, but I am proud of my work. The projects I manage have helped hundreds of patients access new treatment technologies. To me, that is deeply meaningful. But in my brother's and Emily's eyes, I was just the girl who works at a small company, not worthy to sit at the wedding table. I was born into a family with a medical tradition. My father is a neurologist who once taught at Johns Hopkins and later opened his own private practice in the Boston suburbs. My mother was a head nurse who retired early to take care of the family. I, from a young age, was the different child. I liked taking apart machines, tinkering with software, writing code. Those interests always made me feel out of place at family dinners, where people talked about brain surgeries or emergency cases I couldn't fully follow. Michael was different. He was the model any parent would be proud of. A top student, tall and composed, he went to medical school at 18, earned prestigious scholarships, and consistently ranked at the top of his class. Since childhood, I had been told to follow your brother's example and try harder. Whenever I achieved something in my field, the family would nod politely and quickly move on to ask what Michael had been doing that week at the hospital. I don't blame my parents. I understand their generation values medicine because it saves lives and is honorable. Still, I longed for a look of recognition. Even once to hear my father say, "I'm proud of you." I had never had that. After Michael graduated, he began to change. From a polite young man, he slowly grew cold and arrogant. He stopped coming home for holidays, stopped calling. Whenever we met, he'd throw half-jokes at me. "You still stuck on that useless coding job?" Or, "I save lives in a day. What good does sitting at a keyboard do?" I got used to it. I kept quiet because I thought maybe he was under pressure. But it became harder to accept when I heard from one of my father's colleagues that Michael had failed interviews at 2 major hospitals. Despite his credentials, he was judged as lacking empathy toward patients and even behaving condescendingly toward chief physicians. In the end, my father had to call him back to work at our family clinic temporarily, a way to preserve the family's face. At the time, I thought perhaps this would be an opportunity for Michael to relearn humility. I was naive. Since returning to the clinic, he boasted everywhere that he was the successor, that he would reform my father's outdated model. He treated working there as his right, not as the help it was. Emily, my brother's fiancée, arrived like a character from an expensive TV drama. The daughter of a New York real estate tycoon, she had studied law but left her job to focus on building a home. From the first meeting, I sensed something off. Her smile always stopped at the edge of her lips, and her eyes betrayed judgment whenever they landed on my worn handbag or the older Apple Watch on my wrist. At a coffee shop not long before the wedding, Emily casually asked me in front of others, "Allison, how much are you planning to give for the wedding? For a family at your level, $5,000 seems appropriate, don't you think?" My throat tightened. I had planned to give $2,000, a significant amount for me. But to Emily it was an insult. She smiled, sipped her coffee and said lightly, "You'd want to be remembered as a gracious person, right?" I smiled back, though inside I was cooling. I didn't want to make a scene. I thought if the wedding ended peacefully I could put some distance between myself and them. I was wrong. At that ceremony, when she took the mic and bluntly announced that my parents and I were unfit to attend, all the quiet humiliations I had tolerated became a deep, cutting wound. I looked at my father. He stood there, his shoulders trembling, not in anger but in something else. My mother gripped his hand, her eyes confused. And I saw clearly. In that magnificent room, among pristine white bouquets and the gentle strains of piano music, my family was being treated as trash, to be swept away to preserve the reputation of an arrogant man and an ambitious woman. I don't know how long I stood there. I could no longer hear the world around me. I only heard my heart, slow, heavy, aching as if someone were squeezing my veins. In that instant, I remembered something my father said when I was promoted at my company last year. "I don't understand all of your work, but if it means something to you, do it with all your heart." And I had done it. But did that matter when the people closest to you turned their backs on your presence? I stepped back, but I did not leave. Not because I was weak, but because I felt I needed to stay and witness the true faces of those who pretended to be noble. I had a deep sense that the storm at that wedding was only just beginning. I remember that evening clearly. A family dinner that seemed ordinary, with the table set neatly by my mother, red wine, small candles, and her signature braised beef, the dish she always prepared when the whole family was present. My father sat at the head of the table as he always did, quietly. My mother tried to keep the mood light, but no one could deny that such dinners were becoming rarer. Each time felt more like a staged performance, where genuine kindness was squeezed out by masked barbs disguised as polite smiles. Michael arrived late, wearing a brand new Burberry coat, stepping in with his familiar air of self-importance. He sat beside me, raised his glass, glanced around the table and let out a small, condescending laugh as if granting us the favor of his presence. I stayed silent, focused on my plate, but eventually his gaze found me. "Allison, you still working at that small startup?" His tone was casual, as if asking after a neighbor. I looked up, keeping my composure. "I'm a project manager at Axiom Tech, working on medical diagnostic software. Not a startup anymore. We just opened our third office in California." He snorted. "Oh, that's something. But sitting behind a desk all day can't compare to the feeling of holding a scalpel and saving someone's life, right?" My father frowned slightly. My mother watched me anxiously. I forced a faint smile and said nothing more. Comments like that were too familiar. To Michael, work only mattered within the constraints of the medical field he idolized. I had tried to explain, citing cases where my software detected illnesses early and saved lives. He never listened. The meal continued under a taut atmosphere. My mother occasionally passed me food, a small gesture of consolation. My father barely spoke, clearing his throat when Michael went too far. It was clear he no longer had the energy to intervene. He had aged and perhaps grown weary of watching his children drift apart. After dinner, I helped my mother clear the table while Michael took a phone call on the porch. Bringing the last dish to the kitchen, I overheard part of his conversation, his voice low but clear enough to stop me in my tracks. "Yeah, it's just for show. My father will hand over the clinic by the end of the year. I just need the right moment to announce it. That director title will be mine soon." My hands trembled as I went back to the sink. He was lying. There was no plan for my father to hand over the clinic. I had heard my father tell my mother, "Michael isn't ready to run it. He lacks many things, especially bedside manner." Yet Michael painted an entirely different future to prop up a fragile ego. I told no one. Not out of fear, but because I didn't want to hurt my father. I knew he still held hope that Michael would change. No matter how many disappointments, he kept that hope like a thin thread connecting him to the son he once proudly raised. The truth, however, was that Michael had failed at least 3 interviews at major hospitals. I once happened upon a rejection email from a San Diego hospital on our home computer when I needed to use the printer. The message was blunt: "We appreciate Dr. Michael L.'s technical qualifications, but his lack of cooperation in clinical discussions and negative responses in emergency scenario simulations indicate he is not suited to our environment." I had no right to interfere in his life, But I couldn't help thinking of the consequences if my father truly handed the clinic over to someone like Michael. No one in the family knew I had quietly contacted the chief physician at the clinic, my father's trusted colleague, to ask about the situation. He confirmed to me, Michael was sloppy, often late, and had even clashed with an elderly patient for saying the patient talked too much. I held all of this inside. No one asked, so I did not tell. Those truths were like hairline cracks, silently spreading through the already unstable foundation of my family. Then one day my mother invited me out for lunch. The meal was light, but her eyes carried a weight. Midway through her apple pie, she said slowly, "Do you think your father made a mistake bringing Michael back to the clinic?" I looked up. I had never seen my mother question my father's decision before. I didn't know how to answer, so I asked gently, "Why are you asking?" She sighed. "He's not the same. He treats the clinic as his own, speaks to the nurses as if they were subordinates. Your father stays quiet. Perhaps he fears if he speaks he'll push Michael away." I squeezed my mother's hand. "Mom, your father only wants what's best for him. But if he doesn't change, letting him run a place that saves lives would be dangerous." She was silent for a long time. The meal ended with the clinking of spoons and the whisper of wind through the cafe window. When the wedding invitations were finally sent, I knew the storm had officially arrived. An extravagant ceremony at Chicago's most expensive hotel, guest list full of notable figures from medicine and business. Emily messaged me, politely suggesting I prepare a gift befitting the family's standing. Michael attached a PDF of wedding expenses and wrote, "Any support would be appreciated." I said nothing. Looking over the itemized costs, it was clear. They were living in an illusion no one dared to puncture. Until that day at the wedding, as I stood there, I realized all the cracks in my family were beginning to shatter for real. I met Emily on an autumn evening when Michael brought her home for dinner. It drizzled lightly and dark red leaves dotted the lane to my parents' suburban house, a peaceful, cozy scene, if not for the chill hiding behind that poised smile. Emily walked in wearing a fitted beige sweater dress, her hair neatly in a bun, pointy shoes glinting under the porch light. She smiled politely, shook my hand with practiced grace, and addressed my mother as "Ma'am." I couldn't deny she looked put together, exactly the image Michael had always chased. Elegant, poised, and adept at saying the right thing at the right time. My mother seemed pleased. She kept offering Emily more food, praising the meal as if a beautiful guest elevated everything. My father remained calm, nodding at a few stories Emily shared about her time at an international law firm in Manhattan. I sat quietly observing. Under the warm yellow light of the dining room, she seemed to fit perfectly with my family, or at least with the version of my family Michael wanted. But in those fleeting moments when our eyes met, I saw something I couldn't name, as if that polished courtesy were a mask worn to hide something sharper, colder underneath. After dinner, I helped my mother with the dishes. Michael and Emily stepped out to the back porch where my father was nursing a glass of wine. My mother leaned in and whispered to me, "Emily seems mature. Maybe she'll keep Michael grounded. I'm glad he finally found someone." I only nodded. There was something in my mother's tone that made me ache. Not because of the hope for my brother, but because I felt pushed outside the circle of that joy. I began looking into Emily, not from mere curiosity but from a sense that I needed to know. I checked her old LinkedIn profile and found she had worked as a legal assistant at a New York law firm for 3 years, ending just over a year ago. There were no recent updates, no new positions, no projects listed. At a coffee with my mother, I asked, "What exactly is Emily doing now?" Michael sipped his coffee and answered nonchalantly, "She left. That job didn't fit her long-term goals." "What long-term goals?" I asked, gently but curious. He frowned and replied quickly, "She wants to focus on the family. And later she'll help me run the clinic." I almost dropped my spoon. Emily hadn't studied medicine and had no background in healthcare. How could she be clinic manager? Michael continued as if he'd rehearsed it, "She's organized. I think if I hand over the financial and administrative tasks to Emily, I can focus on the clinical side." I stared at him for a long time. A man who had been rejected by major hospitals because of poor communication skills was planning to entrust the operation of a medical facility to someone with no industry experience. Everything suddenly made more sense. Not long after, at a friend's gathering Michael hosted at an upscale downtown restaurant, I overheard Emily telling one of his friends that she would soon be the director's wife. Then she sipped her champagne with obvious pride. She talked about how a stable life is a well-deserved reward after years of fierce competition in law, and I saw admiration and envy in the listener's eyes. I felt nothing but a sharp coldness, dependence. I said nothing. I didn't want to break the picture Michael was trying to paint for everyone. A successful doctor about to inherit the clinic from his father, marrying the daughter of a tycoon who had voluntarily given up her prestige to be with him. I went home heavy-hearted. A question repeated in my mind: do my parents see this? Or are they choosing to believe whatever makes them less disappointed? That night, as I worked on a report on my laptop, my mother came into the room with a steaming cup of tea. She set it on the table, sat beside me, sat quietly for a moment, then asked, "Allison, you don't like Emily, do you?" I looked up. My mother's eyes were not reproachful, only sad. I paused, then answered, "I don't hate her. But I don't believe she's sincere with Michael." My mother sighed. "I see it. The way she looks at you, it's not kind. But your father hopes that if Michael settles down and marries, he'll become steadier." I took my mother's hand. "Mom, a marriage built on appearance won't help anyone grow. It only pushes things further from reality." She said nothing more. We sat quietly and listened to the winter wind brushing against the window. From that moment, I understood things wouldn't stop at looks or sarcastic remarks. Emily was not merely Michael's fiancée. She was slowly, carefully, and dangerously inserting herself into what belonged to my family. If no one spoke up, she might very well succeed. On a Monday morning, I received an email from Emily. The subject was short: about the wedding gift. Inside was a carefully crafted paragraph, polite wording that nonetheless hid a coercive intent. Emily wrote that they were eager to have me attend their special day, and understood that everyone has their own circumstances, but at high-profile events like this, especially given Michael's family standing, the wedding gift should reflect respect and social position. At the bottom, a gentle closing. Typically at such events, gifts from immediate family range around $5,000. I'm sure you'd want to show proper spirit. I sat very still, eyes fixed on the screen. I had planned to give $2,000. No small amount on my manager's salary, but enough to keep dignity and propriety. To them, though, it was like a slap to the family's honor. That afternoon I went by the house. Dad was on the back porch adjusting the outdoor heater. I brought the itemized wedding budget Michael had posted in the family group. Total budget, $60,000. The reception was booked on the top floor of the Drake Hotel in Chicago. The champagne list included imports from France. The floral design was a bespoke concept, and they'd hired a prominent New York wedding planner. I handed the budget sheet to my father without a word. He read it, folded it, and exhaled as if he'd swallowed a large stone. "I promised to help him with the wedding, but I didn't think he'd turn it into a spectacle," he said. I sat down beside him. "I don't think this is about marriage. It's about image." He nodded slowly. "Michael never thinks about sustainability. He only thinks about what will impress." My mother came out from the kitchen, flowers still on her hands. "Emily called me at lunch," she said. She talked about the ceremony and tactfully asked what we thought would be an appropriate gift from the siblings. I closed my eyes. I didn't need to ask more. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her you would do the right thing." My throat went dry, but I smiled. "I won't let anyone lose face," I said. "But I also won't humiliate myself just to match someone else's taste." My mother didn't answer. She returned to the kitchen. After a moment of silence, my father spoke up. "I'll cover the entire wedding cost," he said. "But on one condition." I turned to look at him. "He has to work 3 full months at the clinic with no patient complaints. If a single patient complains about his attitude or lack of care, I will stop supporting him." "Does he agree to that?" "Not yet. But I'll make it clear." A few days later I met Michael at a cafe near the hospital. He waited, fidgety, eyes fixed on his phone. "I heard about Dad's condition," he said bluntly. I was silent a few seconds before answering. "I think it's fair." He set his phone down and leaned back. "That's none of your business. Why do you keep getting involved?" I looked straight into his eyes. "I'm not interfering. I just don't want Dad to fund a wedding that doesn't start with responsibility." Michael sneered. Is Dad testing me, or are you trying to prove you're smarter? No one needs to prove anything. I'm not competing with you. So what do you plan to give as a gift? The question hit like a cold splash. I intend to give $2,000. You should rethink that. Why? That's reasonable. I'm not taking a year's savings just to match the tone of an expensive dress. Michael was silent. I didn't miss the expression in his eyes, not anger now but bewilderment. Maybe for the first time he realized I was no longer the younger sister who always stepped back and stayed quiet under every imposition. Did she pressure you? He didn't answer. Why do you let her talk about money for you? Emily's used to Manhattan-style weddings. You know that. Her circle is different. I gave a flat laugh. Different, to the point of not respecting other people's circles? Michael stood up, leaving his coffee half drunk. Do as you like. But don't ruin my wedding day. I sat alone. A server came to clear the table and gently asked, Do you need anything else? I shook my head and stared out the window. Cars flowed toward downtown where lights were beginning to glow. Something inside me dimmed, not affection but expectation. I had hoped that if I tried hard enough, my family would see me as I really am. Perhaps to be seen, sometimes you must stop trying to fit into someone else's spotlight and learn to shine on your own. One afternoon, while I was at the house to print materials my father needed for a clinic meeting, I walked into his office. The familiar scent of old oak, light filtering through the thin curtains, the desktop computer still open. My mother was at the market and my father stuck at the clinic. I intended to print and leave, but a new email notification on the screen made me freeze. The subject line hit me, regarding the interview results for Dr. Michael L. My finger hovered on the mouse. I hadn't intended to invade anyone's privacy, but the email had been sent to the clinic's shared inbox used by my father and administrative staff, not a personal account. The content made it impossible to look away. We thank Dr. Michael L. for attending the interview at our hospital. However, after review, the hiring panel found the candidate displayed impatience during clinical discussions, reacted inappropriately to feedback, and demonstrated a lack of respect for patients in simulated scenarios. Therefore, we regret that we cannot proceed with Dr. Michael as a candidate. I read it 3 times. Each phrase was more than a rejection. It was an indictment of professional character. No one at home had mentioned this. My parents had clearly kept it quiet. I suddenly understood. Michael had returned to the clinic not by choice but because no other place would accept him. I don't remember how long I sat there. The air in the room suddenly felt thick despite the open window. On the desk was a graduation photo of Michael, diploma in hand, standing next to my father, the man who'd always dreamed his son would carry on the legacy. When I stepped away from the computer, my hands shook, not with anger but with pity and sorrow. Michael had constructed an image he could not sustain. But that was not the end. A few days later, I ran into Lana, an old law school friend of Emily's, at a tech conference. After small talk, Lana's eyes flickered, and she leaned in as if to share a secret. You still in contact with Emily? She asked. I nodded, wary. Lana smiled and lowered her voice. When she worked at Rawlings, she dated a well-known doctor in Connecticut who was almost 2 decades older. Everyone thought they'd get engaged, until his wife showed up at the office with divorce papers. I froze. Lana shrugged. Emily left the firm shortly after. No one knows exactly what happened. She cut ties with colleagues. We thought she'd leave the field for good. Who would have thought she'd come back to Boston carrying the title doctor's fiancé? I thank Lana for telling me. My mind tangled. The pieces fit together. Sudden resignation, a past she avoided, and now a wedding with someone her family viewed as a bright future. I stepped out into the drizzle and stood under the conference awning, listening to the rain on the pavement, wondering, should I speak up? Should I stop the wedding before things went too far? That night I visited my parents. My mother was making soup, my father reading case files in the living room. I sat beside him, silent for a moment, then gently said, I found an email from Boston Central addressed to you. About Michael. He did not look up. I knew you'd see it someday. Why didn't you say anything? Do you think telling you would have changed anything? He said, still eyes on the papers. At least he should face reality. He can't keep living in illusions no one dares to puncture. My father set the stack of files down and looked at me a long time. There was no anger in his gaze, only exhaustion. Michael is weaker than you think. He's brilliant on paper, but he can't handle the collisions of real life. If I were blunt, he would crumble. And Emily. I interrupted him. I've heard about her time at the law firm. About the man who was already married. My father narrowed his eyes. Do you have proof? Not yet. But a friend of mine who studied with her confirmed it. He sat up straight as if pulled out of a dream he did not want to wake from. I know she's ambitious. But I didn't expect. I looked at him and said slowly, I don't have the right to judge past things. But if she's with him only for the label, clinic director, do we really have to help facilitate a marriage that's fundamentally wrong? My mother stood at the kitchen doorway, drying a dish towel, watching the two of us with quiet eyes. My father leaned back in his chair, his hands folded over his stomach. His voice was deeper than usual. If this gets exposed now, it won't only affect Michael. The clinic's reputation will be damaged as well. Medical media pay attention to every detail. So, you want me to stay silent? I want you to hold back. Wait and see who she really is. And let Michael recognize the truth for himself. There are lessons that cannot be taught with words. I bowed my head, forcing a heavy breath into my chest. Yes, some lessons must be paid for with wounds. But if those wounds drag down the whole family, our honor, and everything my father built over decades, is that worth it? I stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the night sky, clouds rolling in. Under the dim lights, the old trees stood still, as if listening to every line of the conversation inside the house I had just left. Everything was sliding toward a place I could no longer control. Yet deep inside I knew, someday someone would have to speak the truth, even if it meant paying a price. The wedding was held at the Drake Hotel, the historic building on the shore of Lake Michigan, where velvet-draped walls and gilded ceilings created a grandeur that felt almost cold. From the moment I entered the grand hall, I saw everything designed to flaunt power. A string quartet playing classical music, servers in tuxedos pushing trays of sparkling drinks past tables draped in satin, and guest name cards written in gold ink placed precisely beside crystal glasses. I walked in with my parents wearing a modest moss green dress. My mother carefully adjusted my father's sleeve, while he kept a composed expression, revealing no emotion. All three of us understood we did not belong here, at least by the standards Michael and Emily had set. The guests were faces familiar in medicine, business, and politics. I saw the dean of the medical school where my father once taught, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, the owners of a private hospital chain in the Northwest, and even the state senator. Everyone was elaborately dressed, shaking hands with thin smiles, their eyes subtly sizing each other up. When a small bell chimed to signal the ceremony, people began moving toward the main room. The doors opened to a scene like a performance for the elite. Floral pedestals rising to the ceiling, golden lights casting down on a stage draped in white silk, footsteps echoing to the sound of the piano. That space was not made for simplicity or sincerity. I sat at an outer table near the service aisle. My mother sat beside me, gripping my hand as if passing warmth to help me stay calm. My father remained silent, staring into the distance as if watching a play he had not expected to see. Michael appeared in a tailored black suit, his silver-gray tie standing out in the bright room. He stepped onto the stage, smiled at the crowd, and reached for Emily, who was slowly walking into the swelling music. Her wedding dress flowed for yards and yards, studded with crystals that made the room glitter like a thin mist. When they stood together at center stage, I thought they would begin the traditional rite, but they did not. Emily, still wearing that perfect smile, moved to the microphone. She paused a few seconds as if taking a breath, then spoke softly. Before we officially begin the ceremony, I want to say a few words from the bottom of my heart. The entire room fell completely silent. I looked at my father. His expression began to change. Emily turned and looked directly toward the table where my parents and I sat. Her smile did not change, but her gaze was colder than steel. I'm grateful that everyone is here to share this important moment. But alongside the joy, I also want to point out a reality that I think everyone here recognizes. She stopped. The air thickened. I could hear my own heartbeat. Emily continued. At a formal event like this, clearly not everyone is suited to be present. There are people whose presence makes me feel embarrassed. A poor family with uncouth manners and outdated thinking, truly lowers the event's class. All eyes immediately turned to my parents and me. Some guests glanced at one another, some frowned, others forced an awkward smile. I was stunned. My mother squeezed my hand so hard her fingernails left marks. My father still did not move. Emily did not stop. She lifted her chin and spoke slowly as if delivering a lesson. In modern society, class is built from knowledge, from taste, from how people demonstrate responsibility and financial standing. I don't hesitate to say, I hope certain people, specifically Allison and her family, will consider leaving before the cake cutting. A surge of uncontrollable whispers rippled through the hall. I turned to Michael, expecting him to speak up and stop the storm he had allowed to be unleashed at his own wedding. But he only smiled, a proud, arrogant smile. Emily's right, he said into the microphone. We worked very hard to organize a wedding worthy of the future of me, of us, which will soon be the future of the most renowned clinic in Boston. He turned his head and looked toward our table. And to grow, sometimes you have to select who you want by your side. A few claps came from Emily's circle of friends. As for me, I felt as if someone had pushed me out of the place I had once called home. I was about to stand when my father suddenly laughed. A large laugh ringing like a church bell. The entire hall froze. Every head turned toward him. He rose very slowly, placed his napkin on the table with deliberate care. My mother looked at him bewildered. I remained paralyzed. His back was straight, his eyes bright, and his right hand gently tapped my shoulder as reassurance. Very good, he said in his deep, rough voice, each word clear. Truly, very good. The room was so silent you could hear the faint clink of glasses together. Some people began to shift backward. The atmosphere seemed to freeze. He looked at Michael, then Emily, that half-smile still on his face. You two have opened my eyes. I had thought a wedding was a time for connection, where people could reconcile differences, where love rises above the petty. His gaze grew colder. But no. Today, you've turned it into a stage for showing off, where a person's worth is measured by wedding gifts and designer gowns. Michael pressed his lips together. Emily stepped back a half pace, clutching the microphone tightly. My father scanned the room and spoke with a clear, resonant voice. I am a physician. All my life I have treated patients from every class. I have never judged them by income or status. Yet today I hear my own son stand here and categorize his family with such a cheap yardstick. He paused, eyes reflecting deep disappointment. I do not feel ashamed to be called a poor family. But I am heartbroken that my son, the one I raised with everything I had, believes wealth is the only thing that defines a person's character. An absolute silence fell over the room. No cough, no clink of glass, not even the background music. I dared not move. In that moment I realized, my father would no longer remain silent. And once he had stood up, no one could push us out of a place we had never truly left. My father walked toward the stage with steady steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. The eyes in the hall followed him as if he were the only person there with the weight to bring this ceremony back to a serious reality. When he stood beside Michael and Emily, the few steps between them felt like an abyss. He took the microphone from Emily without looking at her and fixed his gaze on his son. Michael, he said, his voice even and clear as if reading testimony, you are not the director of the clinic. You never have been, and you will not be if you maintain your current approach to work. The ballroom fell silent. I heard someone drop a glass at a nearby table. Emily stepped back, clutching her dress. Michael winced as if he couldn't understand what his father was saying. But my father gave him no chance to respond. You came back to the clinic because no one else would take you. 3 major hospitals rejected you after interviews due to poor attitude, impatience with patients, and unprofessional reactions to feedback. You can deny it, but I have kept all the rejection letters on file. All eyes were now on Michael. People murmured, frowned, shook their heads. Emily scanned the room, then looked at Michael, her lips twitching as if to say something very small. Michael bowed his head. He could no longer smile. My clinic has been built over nearly 30 years, my father continued, with a reputation founded on dedication, not publicity or lavish parties. You have damaged that reputation enough. Right here I declare, you are no longer a staff member of this clinic. I saw my mother clutch my hand, her eyes reddening. The guests sat motionless, no one daring to make a sound that might shatter the tense air. Then my father looked at me and nodded. I stood, walked slowly toward the stage, and felt the chill in my chest dissolve. No more shaking, no more fear. I was holding the printed email I had retrieved from my father's inbox, the response from a top Boston hospital about Michael's failed interview. I took the microphone, my voice soft but steady. I'm Allison, the groom's sister. Many people in this room have heard Michael speak about his role at the clinic. But the truth is very different. I raised the paper and read the lines in perfect silence. The candidate displayed an arrogant attitude toward the interview panel, repeatedly interrupted others, refused to accept feedback on emergency patient management, and lacked teamwork skills. Excerpted from the rejection letter of Massachusetts General Hospital. Whispers swelled. I could hear people saying, I didn't expect that. I thought he was excellent. Then why is there a wedding like this? Emily leaned toward Michael, eyes wide with shock, while he stood motionless, his face ashen. Under the brilliant lights, he was no longer the center of admiration. He had been exposed as a failed name, turned over by his own family on his wedding day. I bowed and returned to my table, passing by astonished faces that had once called Michael a rising doctor. Each step felt like retrieving a little bit of the confidence I had lost, a piece of the place that had been taken from me over many years. Then something happened I never expected. A woman in the front row stood up. She wore a dark blue evening gown and white lace gloves, her lips pressed tight. She was Emily's mother. She didn't look at anyone, she stood, turned slightly toward her husband, the imposing man of influence, and inclined her head. He understood immediately. Without a word, they both left the hall, their footsteps on the wooden floor sounding like a final judgment on the collapsed performance. Emily froze. She looked toward her parents as they left, then at Michael, mouth opening without producing a sound. All the radiance of her sparkling gown suddenly meant nothing. Standing on that vast stage, she looked painfully small. I returned to my seat where my mother gave me a slight nod, and my father calmly returned to the table as if he had just completed a long-held moral operation. No one stopped him. No one was angry with him, because everything he had said was true. And when truth is spoken with integrity, no one can refute it. I looked at him. He still stood there, no longer wearing that constant air of confidence. I felt no glee, nor anger. In me at that moment there was only emptiness. A brother I had once admired had lost everything, not because of failure but because of arrogance. And nothing could save him now except himself. The atmosphere in the ballroom remained thick after my father's declaration. I returned to our table, trying to stay composed under the lingering eyes. My mother took my hand gently and squeezed. Her hand trembled but felt warm, like a small wall against a big storm. Michael remained motionless on the stage, his gaze unfocused as if he had stepped out of a nameless dream. Emily nearly collapsed into the chair beside him, her lips dry and mascara smudging at the corners of her eyes. She had lost the poise of the woman who had once walked under the lights like a queen. Then, at that exact moment, my phone rang. At first I meant to ignore it, but the caller ID showed the name. Lena, Regional CEO at Axiom Tech, the company where I work. I asked my mother's permission, then hurried into the hallway, my heart pounding. Lena didn't call at hours like this unless it was important. I answered and held the phone to my ear. Allison, Lena's voice came, brimming with excitement. They signed. Vanderbilt Health just executed the full partnership package. $18 million, 3 years. Rolling out an AI diagnostic system across the entire hospital network. I froze, staring down the corridor where city lights filtered through the thick glass. For a moment I almost couldn't breathe. They actually signed? I managed. Not only did they sign, they agreed to announce it on their internal channel right away. We'll send confirmation emails to the whole team shortly. And Allison, her voice softened, the executive board approved the proposal. You will be the national project director. I leaned back against the cold wall, my hand tightening around the phone. Part of me wanted to scream, the rest felt choked. All the unnoticed efforts, the late nights, the meetings where I'd been cut off for being the youngest in the room. Today, finally, someone was listening. Before I could speak, Lena continued, her tone full of enthusiasm. One more thing. Kind of interesting. Vanderbilt just uploaded the announcement video to their internal feed, and some partners are already sharing it on medical social networks. You might get more attention than expected. I said goodbye, and before I could exhale, a notification chimed from the stage. The MC's voice came over the speakers, a mix of bewilderment and delight. "Excuse me, everyone, we seem to have a special announcement just updated." I turned back into the ballroom. The LED screen behind the stage, which had been used for wedding slides, flipped to a white background with the Vanderbilt Health logo and a large headline: "Vanderbilt Health officially signs strategic partnership with Axiom Tech. Project Director, Allison Lane." The room seemed to break in a single inhalation held too long. Some guests were skeptical at first, then applause rose. It spread from the left table across the middle to the far side. The man seated beside Mr. Whitmore nodded. "That's the woman who spoke just now." "Impressive." A middle-aged physician leaned toward my mother and asked, "Are you Allison's mother? Congratulations. She gives me hope for the next generation." I stood in the ballroom feeling as if I no longer felt the weight under my feet. Everything happened so fast, so unexpectedly, but it was real and undeniable. After years of living in Michael's shadow, I had never imagined I would be recognized not by comparison, but for the value I'd created. Michael stood still, eyes glued to the screen. I saw his hands clench at his sides, the veins at his neck taut. Emily turned to him, her lips forming words, but he did not respond. He could not. No one in that situation could absorb such a shock and remain composed. I walked slowly back to my table. A few people came to shake my hand. Someone asked for my business card. A reporter from a medical trade magazine approached to request an interview at a forthcoming event. My mother sat quietly and smiled through tears. She didn't say a word, she simply held my hand tightly. My father remained calm. When I sat down, he turned toward me and said in his deep voice, "You have done better than I ever imagined. Not because you succeeded, but because you held on to your dignity when everything around you tried to deny you." I squeezed his hand, my eyes stinging. What I felt then was not triumphal joy, but the rare feeling of being truly seen, not by title or position, but because my long silence had finally spoken at the right moment. I glanced back at the stage. Michael had stepped down, his face was pale. Emily sat frozen, her eyes vacant. The sparkle of her wedding dress now looked out of place in the faces that no longer gave deference. A wedding meant to confirm status had become the stage for a lesson. Reputation cannot be bought, and people cannot be controlled with money. I took a deep breath to steady my heart. Amid the applause, I could still hear my father's quiet exhale, and to me, it was the most beautiful sound of the evening. The applause did not last long. It marked a moment and then gave way to a long, uneasy silence. After the LED screen went dark and the MC awkwardly changed the subject, the ballroom atmosphere grew heavy, like a thin smoke settling over glasses and over faces trying to avoid the name at the center of the collapse. Michael left the stage as someone with nowhere to go. He moved through the crowd in silence, trying to keep his posture, but each step seemed laden with stone. I watched without satisfaction or pity, only the sensation of witnessing a cracked statue, eroded from within rather than shattered by a single blow. Emily could no longer maintain her composed facade. She slumped in her chair, her wedding dress askew, makeup smudged around her eyes. A bridesmaid stepped forward to fix her hair, but Emily waved her away. She was no longer the center of admiration, only a misfitting piece in the lavish painting she had so meticulously tried to create. I saw her parents standing by the exit, their faces drained of color. Her mother, who had once offered a haughty handshake and surveyed my mother from head to toe, could not speak. Her father, a prominent real estate businessman, leaned in and whispered something to his wife. Then, wordlessly, they turned and left the ballroom, their footsteps on the wooden floor like a final judgment on the fallen spectacle. Emily looked up just then and called, "Mother." Her voice broke. No one turned. The room held its breath. Nobody dared comfort her, and nobody wanted to witness one more public collapse. After that, the guest list thinned. Important attendees rose and left quietly, department chairs, leading physicians, old classmates of Michael, stepping out the side door to avoid media cameras now gathering outside. I looked at my parents. My father calmly finished his tea. My mother gave me a small nod as if to say there was nothing left to add. We left the hotel together under the dim city lights and mist. Not a word was spoken on the drive home. But inside me something closed softly, Not a door, but an old wound that had stopped bleeding. 3 days later, I received an internal press release from our communications team. Vanderbilt Health had published the partnership announcement across major medical news channels. The New England Medical Journal even ran a full page on the development potential of the technology won overseas. They referenced my name in 3 successive lines, and calls from research institutes began pouring in. During that time, I got a call from someone who had worked with Michael during his temporary stint at the clinic. Rachel Nguyen, a young physician much loved by patients. Her tone was low when she mentioned Michael. I heard he applied to 2 private clinics in the city, but both rejected him. One said frankly they didn't want to get involved in media trouble. The other knew about the wedding. They don't want anyone who behaves recklessly in public. I was silent for a long moment. Rachel added, "I'm not glad about it, just sorry. If he would only listen a little." But Michael did not know how to listen. Even after my father severed his employment and refused to pay the $60,000 for the wedding, Michael never apologized. He disappeared from social media and cut contact with the family. People said he rented a small apartment in the suburbs, somewhere much cheaper than his previous lifestyle. Emily was seen leaving the apartment a few days later with suitcases and cardboard boxes. The marriage never occurred, ended like a contract that failed to meet its terms. I heard that Emily's parents completely cut ties with her. Her father issued an internal statement at his company. "The family is not involved in our daughter's personal choices and the mistaken decision in her marriage." Those words read like a sentence. A week later, my mother told me at dinner, Michael called and asked to borrow $5,000 for a down payment. I set my spoon down slowly. "What did your father say?" He told him, "If you still think family responsibility is a line of credit you can draw on every time you make a mistake, then you need to relearn what it means to be a decent person." I nodded and asked no further questions. I felt no anger, only sorrow for a person who once had everything: foundation, opportunity, love. Instead of using those as a springboard, Michael had made them a pillow to lean on. That pillow has now collapsed and can no longer support the arrogance he wrapped around himself. An old friend who had studied with Michael sent me a screenshot from a private group. In it, Michael posted asking for job leads, any position in healthcare, even in clinical support. No one replied. Or if they did, only with a quick scene. I saved the screenshot, not as evidence or to gloat, but to remind myself of one truth. A career isn't built on titles but on how you treat others when you're standing at the top. As for Emily, I heard she withdrew from social groups on social media, deleted most of the wedding photos, and moved back to New York to live with an aunt. No one knows what she will do next, only that the law firms she used to work with have declined to rehire her. Perhaps what made them wary was not past mistakes, but the way she presented herself, with no boundary between pride and delusion. Things came and went quietly, like a cold wind sweeping through and leaving the ground barren. But for me, it wasn't a loss so much as a cleansing. I began a new journey as National Project Director. Each day was busy, but my heart felt light. No more comparative glances, no more heavy family dinners. Just me and what I had truly built with my own hands and with silence when it was needed. And if anyone asks me whether you should stand up when you are belittled, my answer is yes. But stand up at the right time and in a way that makes others fall silent, so they will listen. That afternoon, after everything that happened at the wedding, we left the hotel as the lights along Chicago Avenue began to cast gold over the damp pavement. The car had rolled only a few feet when my father reached for my hand, holding it quietly but firmly. He didn't look at me. His gaze stayed forward, his voice low as if speaking to himself. "You are the pride of our family, Allison." I could not answer right away. The words were so simple, yet they rang like a distant bell inside me, shining into places in my memory that had hardened from waiting. For years I had gone through meals in silence, attended ceremonies where my name was mentioned at the end of the list, endured the silent comparisons between Michael and me. And now, after everything had been stripped away, I was seen. My father was no longer neutral. He chose to stand with me, not because of a title or a paycheck, but because he understood that a person's worth is not where they stand, but how they rise after being put down. I turned to my mother. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, a gentle smile still hovering on her lips. I think she breathed easier. Not because the wedding collapsed, but because finally what she had kept inside for years had been spoken by her own husband, and with the steadiness I had learned from them. When we got home, none of us said anything more. My mother poured tea, my father switched on the porch light, and I went upstairs to change. The gowns, the layers of makeup, the violin, the 5-tier cake, the hollow congratulations, all of it was left behind the door, weightless. I sat on my balcony and looked down at the small garden my father tends each morning. The yellow chrysanthemums my mother planted when I was a child were now covering the wall. There was a particular quiet peace in that moment. Not because I had beaten anyone or reclaimed something, but because I realized true value never lived in the things people see on stage. I remembered the story of an old patient who used the software I managed to detect a brain tumor at an early stage. He once sent me an email that read simply, "Thank you. Because of the software you developed, my daughter still has her father on her wedding day." At the time I read it and smiled. Now I understood why those words soothed my heart so much. No light is brighter than a life prolonged by dedication. And no social standing outweighs kindness. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work with a different mindset. Vanderbilt Health sent a personal letter of praise. My company held a press conference to announce the project. I was invited to speak at a national medical technology conference where hundreds of hospital representatives, physicians, and software developers from across the states attended. In my speech, I did not mention Michael, the wedding, or what had happened. I spoke only about patients I had never met, about engineers who worked behind screens for months, and about the belief that a modern healthcare system should be not only faster and smarter but more humane. After the talk, an older physician approached me, shook my hand for a long time, and said in a hoarse but sincere voice, "You reminded me why I chose medicine when I was 20. Thank you." I left the hall that day into the afternoon sun streaming through the large panes of glass. Inside me there was no prideful arrogance, only a strange serenity. I no longer needed to be seen in order to exist. I only needed to live the way I believed was right. My parents began to spend more time together. My father no longer went to the clinic every day. He gradually handed cases over to the young doctors he trusted. My mother spent mornings tending the garden and afternoons reading. Each evening they sat on the porch, drinking tea and listening to classical music. As for me, I devoted more time to writing. I wrote about patients, about their experiences within the healthcare system, about small details that change how a person feels about life. I sent those pieces to professional journals and gradually was invited to collaborate with social medicine research institutes. I also started allocating a portion of my salary to establish a small scholarship fund to help underprivileged technology students pursue medical software development. I wanted to give what I had not had before: quiet support without seeking recognition, aimed at the right person at the right time. One day, while preparing documents for an online meeting with a partner, I received a handwritten letter from a girl at a high school in South Chicago, a school where I once spoke to students about careers in technology. She wrote, "I used to think I had to choose medicine or law because everyone said that's what success looked like. But when you stood on that stage and told your story without embellishment, I realized success is not choosing the right field, it's doing what's right for yourself. I want to be a software engineer now. I don't feel ashamed anymore." I folded the letter and kept it in my desk drawer as a memento. No bigger thank you was needed. And I understood clearly, what I pursued was never applause. I didn't need stage lights or to be mentioned at glamorous parties. I needed to keep working to help make the world gentler and more livable, not by title but by heart. I once thought I had to prove who I was. But then I realized, a decent person needs to prove nothing. Sooner or later, decency will speak for itself. And when it does, falsehoods will have nowhere to hide. And if you've listened this far, you probably carry a question like the one I carried for many years. What truly defines a person? Status, money, lavish parties, or how they live when the lights go out? I have my answer. What about you? If you stood in the middle of a family that favored one child and faced mocking words at a wedding, would you walk away in silence, or would you speak up? Do you think true success can be measured by title, or is it something you feel when you look back on the life you've lived? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your story because somewhere, your silence might be waiting for someone to listen. If what I've told resonates with you, follow the channel so you won't miss more honest, heartfelt stories about family, character, and the lessons no one teaches but everyone needs to learn. Because sometimes a moment of listening is enough to help someone find themselves in something that once felt unfamiliar. And who knows, the next story might be yours.